The massive, glass-walled conference room in the downtown Boston law firm was incredibly quiet. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating, aggressively expensive silence that cost $1,000 an hour. I sat at the long, polished mahogany table, holding an incredibly expensive Mont Blanc pen that my father-in-law had given me for Christmas 3 years ago. It was the only gift he had ever given me, and he had only given it to me because he wanted me to use it to sign his corporate tax returns. Sitting directly across from me was my soon-to-be ex-husband, Sebastian Aldridge. He was wearing a bespoke Italian suit, his hair perfectly styled, looking remarkably relaxed for a man who was actively destroying his family. Flanking him on either side, like royal guards protecting a deeply incompetent prince, were his parents, Malcolm and Cordelia Aldridge, and sitting entirely too close to Sebastian, her hand resting aggressively, possessively on his thigh, was Brielle Carter. Brielle was 24 years old. She was a former low-level marketing assistant at Aldridge Crown Properties, the family's massive real estate development firm. She was also 4 months pregnant with Sebastian's child. She wore a tight, highly expensive designer maternity dress, constantly rubbing her small, barely visible belly to ensure everyone in the room, especially me, knew exactly why this meeting was taking place. I was 33. I was a senior forensic accountant, and for the last 8 years, I had been the Aldridge family's most useful, most thoroughly despised financial tool. Let's make this quick, Elara. I have a country club luncheon at 1. Cordelia Aldridge said, her aristocratic, razor-sharp voice cutting through the silence. She looked at me from across the table, like I was a particularly offensive stain on the expensive Persian carpet. The settlement outlined in that binder is extremely generous. You sign the papers today, you take the $100,000, and you formally, permanently relinquish all claims to the Beacon Hill estate. You and the children will need to vacate the premises by Friday at noon. I looked down at the massive legal document sitting in front of me. $100,000 for an 8-year marriage to the sole heir of a multi-million-dollar real estate empire. It was an absolute, breathtaking insult. It was a purely vindictive, calculated number designed to humiliate me, to remind me of my place. 100,000, I asked, my voice completely flat, completely devoid of the hysterical, begging tears they were so desperately hoping to see. Be reasonable, Elara. Don't be greedy, Malcolm Aldridge chimed in, leaning forward, resting his heavy arms on the table. He was a ruthless, deeply corrupt businessman who built his entire empire on toxic debt, aggressive intimidation, and political favors. You brought absolutely nothing into this marriage. You're a middle-class accountant from a state school. You should be down on your knees, grateful we're giving you anything at all. The Beacon Hill House is an Aldridge legacy property. It belongs to Sebastian. It has always belonged to Sebastian. I looked at Sebastian. He didn't even have the fundamental human decency to look ashamed. He was too busy staring at Brielle's chest, looking incredibly bored by the legal proceedings ending his marriage. What about the children, Sebastian? I asked quietly, staring directly into his eyes, forcing him to acknowledge reality. Are you really just going to throw Iris and Theo out of their home? They grew up in that house. Theo's entire medical setup is in his bedroom. You know he needs the specialized air filtration system. Cordelia scoffed loudly, a sharp, ugly sound, waving her manicured hand as if swatting away a fly. Oh, please, Elara, stop using the children as a weapon to extort more money from my son, Cordelia sneered, her face twisting with absolute disgust. We both know Theo requires a different environment. That boy is constantly sick. He's weak. His asthma is a severe, embarrassing liability. Sebastian is building a legacy, Elara. He is the future of Aldridge Crown Properties. He needs a strong, healthy heir to take over the firm. A boy with immaculate, pure genes. Not a child who is fundamentally defective. I felt a cold, absolute, terrifying rage crystallize in the very center of my chest. She had just called my 6-year-old son defective. She had written off my incredibly sweet, highly intelligent, fiercely loving boy because he occasionally needed an albuterol inhaler when the pollen count was high. The Aldridge family was so profoundly obsessed with their own toxic, artificial bloodline so deeply steeped in their own pseudo-aristocratic eugenics that they viewed a minor pediatric respiratory issue as a catastrophic genetic failure. "We're so excited for the ultrasound tomorrow." Brielle suddenly piped up, completely ignoring the horrifying insult Cordelia had just leveled at my son. She held up her left hand, aggressively flashing a massive 4-carat diamond ring. "We booked the VIP luxury suite at the Aurora 5 clinic. Sebastian's mother is even setting up a $5 million generation skipping trust fund for the baby right after the appointment. It's going to be the perfect little Aldridge prince." She smiled at me, a sweet, deeply malicious, entirely victorious smile. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully discarded the boring, middle-class accountant wife and her defective son to make way for the shiny, new, perfectly compliant heir. They thought they were ruthlessly upgrading their bloodline. They assumed that because I was quiet, I was weak. They assumed that because I wasn't screaming and throwing things, I was defeated. They didn't understand what a forensic accountant actually does. My entire career is based on tracking lies. I follow the paper trail. I look at massive, intentionally complex financial structures, and I find the hidden structural weaknesses. I find the rot. And for the last 6 months, I hadn't been crying over my failing marriage. I had been actively, surgically dismantling their entire financial existence. "You want the Beacon Hill house?" I asked Sebastian, my voice perfectly steady, holding his gaze. "It's my house, Elara," Sebastian said smoothly, adjusting his expensive tie. "My family paid the down payment. You just lived in it. It's only fair." I picked up the Mont Blanc pen. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I didn't throw a glass of ice water in Brielle's smug face. I pressed the heavy gold nib of the pen to the paper and signed my name on the final divorce decree. I flipped to the property waiver and signed it. I signed the absolute, irrevocable severance of our financial lives. Cordelia let out a sharp, deeply triumphant breath. Malcolm grinned, looking incredibly satisfied. Brielle leaned over and kissed Sebastian on the cheek, whispering something in his ear that made him laugh. "Smart girl," Malcolm said condescendingly, sliding the $100,000 cashier's check across the mahogany table. "You always were good with paperwork. Now, take your check and get out." "Goodbye, Sebastian," I said quietly, standing up from the table, entirely ignoring the check. "Enjoy your new house." I walked out of the law firm, leaving the $100,000 sitting on the table. I didn't need their pathetic bribe. I stepped into the cold, crisp Boston air, pulled out my encrypted phone, and texted my nanny, Lucia. "It's done. Take the kids to Terminal E." I'm on my way. 2 hours later, I was sitting in the ultra-exclusive, deeply quiet first-class international departure lounge at Logan Airport. Iris and Theo were sitting on a plush leather sofa, happily eating premium snacks and watching cartoons on their iPads. I opened my laptop, connected to the heavily encrypted airport Wi-Fi, and took a deep breath. The execution phase was officially complete. Now, I just had to wait for the detonation. It had all started 7 months ago with a single, incredibly stupid, spectacularly arrogant mistake on Sebastian's part. He had used a joint corporate credit card, a card tied directly to my primary accounting email for tax reconciliation purposes, to book a $4 Searsan weekend suite at a highly exclusive luxury hotel in New York City. When the automated digital receipt pinged my inbox on a Sunday morning, I didn't confront him. I didn't scream. I didn't demand answers. I simply logged into the hotel's secure network portal using the confirmation number, pulled the itemized incidental charges, and saw a room service order for a bottle of Dom Perignon and 2 deeply expensive couples spa treatments, one for Sebastian Aldridge and one for Brielle Carter. That night, while Sebastian was sound asleep in our massive king-size bed, I quietly walked down the hall to his home office. I bypassed his pathetic, easily guessed password security, logged directly into his corporate VPN, and started pulling the master financial ledgers for Aldridge Crown Properties. If I was going to leave a powerful, vindictive family, I needed to know exactly what I was walking away from. I needed leverage. What I found in those deeply buried ledgers didn't just break my heart. It absolutely, profoundly terrified me. Malcolm Aldridge was a massive, systemic fraud. He wasn't a brilliant, untouchable real estate titan. He was a highly leveraged, desperate gambler running a massive, unsustainable shell game. Aldridge Crown Properties was currently sitting on over $15 million of extremely toxic, high-interest commercial debt. I spent weeks meticulously tracing the phantom contractors. He was paying shell companies in Delaware for construction work that was never performed, artificially inflating expenses to dodge millions in federal taxes. He was claiming fake depreciation on properties he didn't even legally own. But that wasn't the terrifying part. The terrifying part was how Malcolm had secured those massive commercial loans in the first place. Because the Aldridge family's actual corporate credit was heavily damaged by years of terrible investments, massive legal settlements, and failed developments, Malcolm had quietly, illegally used me. As a high-income senior forensic accountant with an immaculate, untouchable 820 credit score, my personal financial profile was pristine. Malcolm had explicitly forged my initials on over a dozen massive commercial loan documents, using my personal credit profile as the primary guarantor to secure the incredibly low interest rates, keeping his toxic real estate empire afloat. He had used me as a human financial shield without my knowledge or consent. I still remember the night I found the forged documents. I was sitting in the dark office, my hands shaking not from sadness, but from the sheer, breathtaking audacity of the crime. Malcolm had literally traced my signature from old tax returns. He had submitted them to major federal banks. It was textbook wire fraud. If the commercial real estate market dipped even a fraction of a percent, or if the banks decided to call the loans for an audit, I would be held personally, legally liable for $15 million. They were entirely planning to let me go down with their sinking ship. They were perfectly willing to let me go to federal prison for their debts. I didn't panic. I went to work. Over the next 6 months, I meticulously, quietly, and surgically amputated myself from the Aldridge family. I worked late into the night, operating entirely in the shadows, building a fortress around myself and my children. First, I hired an incredibly aggressive, highly discreet banking lawyer operating out of a different state. We drafted massive, highly detailed, legally binding affidavits, proving that my signatures on the commercial loans were entirely fraudulent, backed by expert forensic handwriting analysis from a former FBI document examiner. We didn't sue Malcolm immediately. That would tip him off. We quietly submitted the affidavits directly to the elite compliance departments of the 3 major banks holding the debt, legally severing my liability under federal fraud statutes. Second, I compiled a 400-page, heavily documented whistleblower dossier. I traced every single phantom contractor, every piece of fake real estate depreciation, and every offshore evasion account Malcolm had used to hide his money from the federal government over the last decade. I mailed the entire, devastating package directly to the Criminal Investigations Division of the IRS via certified mail. Third, I quietly liquidated all of my own personal wealth, the money I had earned, the stock portfolios I had built, and transferred it into a highly secure, entirely untouchable offshore vehicle called the Caledonia Shield Trust, headquartered in Edinburgh, Scotland. And finally, I set the absolute, fatal trap for Sebastian, the Beacon Hill estate. The incredibly expensive legacy house Sebastian had just fought so aggressively to keep in the divorce. Sebastian thought he owned that house free and clear because his father paid the initial down payment. But because Sebastian's personal income was entirely tied to his father's fraudulent shell companies, the massive primary mortgage on the house was heavily subsidized and backed by my verifiable, highly stable corporate income. I had been paying the lion's share of the mortgage for years while he played golf. The incredibly humiliating divorce settlement I had just signed contained a standard, boilerplate financial severance clause. The moment the judge officially stamped the paperwork, my income was legally detached from the mortgage profile. Without my pristine income backing the loan, the bank's automated risk algorithms would immediately trigger a massive default clause. The bank would instantly demand the full, immediate balance of the mortgage, or they would initiate immediate, unyielding foreclosure proceedings. They thought they had viciously taken my house. In reality, I had just signed a legal document that ensured the bank was going to violently take it from them. "Mom?" I looked up from my laptop. Theo was standing next to my chair in the lounge, holding his iPad. He looked perfectly healthy, perfectly brilliant, and absolutely flawless. He wasn't defective. He was my entire world, and I had just secured his future. "Yes, baby?" I asked, smiling warmly at him. "Are we really going to live in a castle?" he asked, his bright eyes wide with innocent excitement. "We're going to live in a beautiful, historic city called Edinburgh, right next to a giant stone castle," I promised him, closing my laptop and sliding it into my leather tote bag. "And the air is going to be incredibly clean. You're going to love it." The crisp, highly professional boarding announcement for the British Airways first-class flight to London Heathrow echoed through the quiet lounge. I stood up, took Iris and Theo by the hands, and walked toward the departure gate. I pulled my American SIM card out of my encrypted phone, dropped it into a nearby trash can, and walked onto the plane. I was officially a ghost. While I was flying 30,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean, sipping premium Earl Grey tea, and watching my children sleep peacefully in their lie-flat seats, the sun was rising in Boston, and the Aldridge family was waking up, completely unaware that they were about to walk into an absolute, biological, and financial apocalyptic massacre. The Aurora 5 maternity clinic was located in the most expensive, highly exclusive medical district in downtown Boston. It catered exclusively to billionaires, professional athletes, and deeply aristocratic families who viewed pregnancy less as a biological process and more as a highly produced, heavily curated corporate event. At 10 a.m. sharp, a sleek, black chauffeured SUV pulled up to the clinic's discreet rear VIP entrance. The Aldridge family stepped out into the crisp morning air, looking absolutely, entirely triumphant. They had successfully evicted the middle-class accountant and her defective son. They had severed the dead weight. They were entirely, aggressively focused on the future of their dynasty. Cordelia Aldridge led the procession, wearing a pristine white Chanel suit and carrying a thick, heavy leather-bound legal folder. Inside the folder was the finalized paperwork for a massive $5 million generation-skipping trust fund. She was absolutely determined to ensure that the perfect Aldridge heir was financially secured and legally untouchable before he was even born. She wanted the baby insulated from any potential future divorce, ensuring the money stayed purely within the bloodline. Sebastian walked next to Brielle, holding her hand, puffing his chest out like a proud, victorious peacock. He had spent the entire morning bragging to his elite friends in a private group chat about how he had ruthlessly upgraded his life. He felt like a king. He genuinely believed he had traded up. Brielle, for her part, played her role perfectly. She was dressed in a flowy, incredibly expensive designer maternity dress, projecting an aura of sweet, innocent maternal glow. But behind the sweet smile, Brielle was a highly calculated predator. She had started as a marketing assistant at Aldridge Crown Properties, specifically targeting Sebastian because she knew he was arrogant, easily flattered, and completely financially dependent on his family. She had tolerated his boring stories and faked her adoration entirely for access to the Aldridge fortune. Following closely behind them were Malcolm Aldridge, aggressively checking his emails on his phone, and Sebastian's younger sister, Avery. Avery was a minor, highly obnoxious social media influencer who obsessively documented her high society lifestyle for hundreds of thousands of followers. She was holding her phone up on a gimbal, actively filming Brielle walking into the clinic for her daily vlog. Walking quietly next to Avery, looking distinctly, incredibly uncomfortable, was her husband, Darius Cole. Darius was a handsome, incredibly athletic man of African American descent, who worked as a high-end personal trainer for Boston's elite. He had always been treated with subtle, deeply condescending microaggressions by the Aldridge family. Cordelia had initially vehemently opposed the marriage, only backing down when Avery threatened to go to the press and expose the family's racism. They tolerated him, but they never accepted him. Darius knew this, and that quiet, simmering resentment was exactly what Brielle had exploited. The clinic staff, trained to cater to every whim of their wealthy clients, immediately ushered the family into the massive, softly lit VIP ultrasound suite. The suite featured plush velvet seating, a cascading indoor water wall, and a massive 80-inch 4K flat-screen monitor mounted on the wall, so the entire family could watch the ultrasound live in stunning high definition. "Oh, this is absolutely perfect," Avery squealed, panning her phone camera around the luxurious room. "Say hi to the vlog, Brielle. We're about to meet the newest Aldridge prince." The bloodline continues. Make sure you all tune in to the live stream next week for the official gender reveal party at the country club. Brielle giggled, posing provocatively for the camera before lying back on the luxurious, heated examination bed. Dr. Rowan Bell walked into the room. He was a highly respected, deeply serious obstetrician who specialized in elite, high-risk pregnancies. He held a thick medical file in his hands. He looked at the massive, chaotic crowd in the room and frowned slightly, his professional demeanor tightening. He hated it when wealthy families treated medical procedures like reality television. "Good morning," Dr. Bell said smoothly, maintaining his strict professional bedside manner. "I see we have quite the audience today. Miss Carter, are you entirely comfortable having the extended family present for the reading of the highly sensitive genetic screening results?" "Oh, absolutely," Cordelia interrupted loudly, stepping forward, practically vibrating with toxic excitement. She slammed the heavy leather folder down on a side table with a resounding thud. "We are an incredibly close family, Dr. Bell. We share absolutely everything. In fact, I have the documents for his trust fund right here. We're going to sign them the absolute moment we see his little face. We want to celebrate." Dr. Bell looked at Cordelia, then back down at the file in his hands. He hesitated for a fraction of a second. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible pause, but to a trained medical observer, it screamed absolute, paralyzing clinical panic. "Very well," Dr. Bell said quietly, clearly deciding that if they wanted a public execution, they would get one. He applied the warm gel to Brielle's stomach and pressed the transducer against her skin. Instantly, the massive 80-inch screen filled with the grainy, black and white image of a developing fetus. The room erupted into collective, highly performative oohs and ahs. Avery shoved her phone closer, trying to get the perfect angle for her followers. Sebastian squeezed Brielle's hand, looking incredibly proud of his own biological capability. "Well, the initial developmental markers are excellent," Dr. Bell narrated smoothly, pointing out the tiny beating heart, the spine, and heart rate is strong. Fluid levels are optimal, and as we suspected from the early blood tests, it is undeniably a boy. "Yes," Sebastian cheered loudly, actually pumping his fist in the air like he had just won a sporting event. "A boy," Cordelia breathed, fake tears of joy welling in her eyes. "A perfect, completely healthy Aldridge boy. The dynasty is secure. Malcolm, hand me my gold pen. I'm signing the trust documents right now." Cordelia reached for the leather folder, pulling out the massive legal contract that would instantly, irrevocably transfer $5 million of Aldridge corporate equity into an untouchable trust for the baby. "Mrs. Aldridge, I must ask you to wait," Dr. Bell said. His voice was no longer warm and accommodating. It was sharp, clinical, and completely, terrifyingly uncompromising. Cordelia froze, her expensive gold pen hovering over the signature line. The entire room fell into a dead, suffocating silence. "Wait," Sebastian asked, his arrogant smile violently faltering. "Wait for what? Is something wrong with him? Does he have asthma like Theo?" "The fetus is perfectly healthy," Dr. Bell confirmed, wiping the gel off Brielle's stomach and turning to face the family. He closed the medical file, holding it tightly to his chest like a shield. "However, as part of our VIP concierge service, we ran a highly expanded, comprehensive, non-invasive prenatal testing genetic panel. The panel screens for a massive array of chromosomal abnormalities and inherited traits. And?" Malcolm demanded, his aggressive, domineering business instincts flaring up. "Spit it out, doctor. We don't have all day." Dr. Bell took a deep breath. He was about to drop a biological nuclear bomb directly into the center of the Aldridge family. The expanded genetic panel flagged a highly specific, dominant autosomal marker, Dr. Bell explained carefully, his words precise and devastating. The fetus is a carrier for the sickle cell trait. The room went completely, absolutely silent. Sebastian frowned, looking wildly confused. He looked at Brielle, who had suddenly gone completely violently pale. Sickle cell? Sebastian scoffed, a short, dismissive laugh escaping his lips. Doc, you have the wrong file. Sickle cell is a genetic trait. Brielle is Caucasian. I am Caucasian. There is absolutely zero history of that trait, anywhere in the Aldridge bloodline. My mother has tracked our ancestry back 300 years. Check the name on the file. You've made a massive clerical error. I assure you, Mr. Aldridge, this is the correct file. Dr. Bell stated firmly, refusing to be intimidated. The DNA sample was taken directly from Miss Carter's blood last week. The lab ran the extraction protocol twice to confirm the anomaly because it was so statistically significant. Then it's a false positive. Cordelia snapped, her voice rising in sheer panic and aristocratic anger. My son's bloodline is immaculate. You need to fire whatever incompetent lab technician ran this test, or I will sue this clinic into the ground and ruin your career. Dr. Bell didn't flinch. He looked directly into Cordelia's eyes, then turned to Sebastian, delivering the final, fatal diagnosis. It is not a false positive, Dr. Bell stated, his voice ringing with absolute, undeniable biological truth. The genetic profile of the fetus clearly indicates that the biological father possesses significant African ancestry. Specifically, the paternal DNA profile strongly correlates with genetic markers highly prevalent in West African demographics. The silence in the VIP suite was so absolute, so suffocatingly heavy, it felt like all the oxygen had been instantly, violently sucked out of the room. No one moved. No one breathed. The only sound was the quiet hum of the ultrasound machine. Sebastian, slowly, mechanically, turned his head and looked at Brielle. Brielle was shaking violently. Her hands were gripping the edges of the examination bed, so hard her knuckles were completely white. Tears were instantly welling in her eyes. She didn't deny it. She didn't scream that it was a mistake. She didn't fight back. She just looked absolutely, profoundly terrified. Brielle? Sebastian whispered, his voice cracking, the arrogant air facade instantly shattering into a million pathetic pieces. Brielle, what is he talking about? I don't, Brielle stammered, hyperventilating, looking desperately around the room for an exit. Slowly, almost mechanically, the entire Aldridge family turned their heads. Cordelia, Malcolm, Avery, Sebastian. They all turned and looked at the only person in the entire VIP suite who possessed the genetic profile the doctor had just described. They all looked at Darius Cole. Darius was standing near the indoor water wall. His handsome face was entirely frozen in absolute, paralyzing terror. He was staring at Brielle with wide, panicked eyes, looking like a man who had just stepped on a landmine. The silence stretched for 3 agonizing seconds. Darius? Avery whispered. Her voice was incredibly small, incredibly fragile, completely unlike her usual loud, confident influencer tone. She looked at her husband, the man she had loved and defended against her family's subtle prejudices for years. Darius, tell me you didn't. Darius couldn't speak. He took a slow, terrified step backward, moving toward the heavy oak door. Darius, tell them it's a mistake. Brielle suddenly shrieked, completely losing her mind, her survival instinct overriding any sense of loyalty to her lover. Tell them it wasn't my fault. You said we were just having fun. You said you hated Avery. The VIP ultrasound suite instantly exploded into absolute, unmitigated chaos. Avery didn't cry. She didn't scream. She let out a guttural, primal sound of pure, unadulterated rage. She dropped her phone, the camera still recording everything for her followers, broadcasting her entire family's destruction live, and lunged across the room. She grabbed Brielle by the hair and violently yanked her off the examination bed. Brielle screamed as Avery dragged the pregnant mistress onto the polished marble floor. You bitch! Avery shrieked, raining open-handed slaps down on Brielle's face, while the younger woman scrambled desperately to protect her stomach. You slept with my husband? You brought him into my family. Avery, stop, Sebastian yelled, completely paralyzed by the shock of the massive betrayal, entirely unable to process the fact that his perfect heir belonged to his brother-in-law. But the violence wasn't contained to the women. Darius, realizing his entire life was completely destroyed, panicked. He tried to sprint for the door, completely abandoning his pregnant mistress and his furious wife. Malcolm Aldridge, despite his age, moved with terrifying, protective speed. He stepped in front of the door and shoved Darius backward with immense force, sending him crashing into a cart of medical supplies. "You piece of trash," Malcolm roared, his face purple with homicidal rage. "You come into my family and you do this? I'll kill you." "It was her idea," Darius screamed desperately, pointing at Brielle, trying to save himself from Malcolm's wrath. "She knew about the trust fund. She knew Cordelia was going to set up $5 million for the baby. She told me if she got pregnant, Sebastian would sign the birth certificate without asking questions, because he was so desperate for a healthy son. She said we could take the money and leave." The revelation hit the room like a physical shockwave. Brielle hadn't just slept with Darius. She had actively, maliciously orchestrated a massive, multi-million-dollar financial fraud against the entire Aldridge family. She had preyed on Sebastian's toxic obsession with genetics, knowing he would blindly claim a healthy boy as his own. She was running a massive con. Cordelia Aldridge stood in the center of the ruined room, clutching the $5 million trust document to her chest. She looked at Brielle, bleeding on the floor. She looked at Darius, cowering against the wall. She looked at Sebastian, who was completely broken, staring blankly at the ultrasound screen, showing a baby that wasn't his. She had just spent the last 8 years relentlessly mocking Elara, calling her a middle-class nobody, calling her son defective. She had driven Elara out of the family to make way for a woman who was actively plotting to steal $5 million of Aldridge money, using a bastard child. Cordelia let out a sharp, horrifying gasp. Her eyes rolled back into her head. The trust document slipped from her trembling fingers, and she collapsed in a dead faint onto the cold marble floor. Dr. Bell, who had wisely retreated to the hallway the absolute moment the violence started, immediately hit the emergency panic button, calling clinic security and the Boston Police Department. The perfect heir was a biological impossibility. The dynasty was shattered. The VIP suite was an absolute war zone. But the destruction of the Aldridge family was only just beginning. Because, while they were bleeding and screaming on the floor of a luxury maternity clinic, the financial bombs I had meticulously planted were officially detonating across the city. The sharp, aggressive wail of police sirens cut through the crisp Boston morning air. Clinic security had aggressively escorted the entire Aldridge family out of the VIP suite and onto the front sidewalk of the Aurora 5 clinic. The scene was an absolute, humiliating public disaster. Avery was sobbing hysterically, completely shattered by her husband's betrayal, mascara running down her face in thick black lines. She was desperately trying to delete the live stream from her phone, but she knew hundreds of people had already screen recorded the entire spectacular implosion. Her influencer career was entirely over. Cordelia, having barely recovered from her dramatic fainting spell, was leaning heavily against a metal light post, hyperventilating and clutching her chest, looking older and more fragile than she had in decades. Darius and Brielle had fled in opposite directions the absolute moment they hit the street, desperate to escape the wrath of the powerful family they had just tried to con. Sebastian stood near the curb, staring blankly at the busy traffic. He looked like a man who had just been hit by a massive freight train. He had thrown away a brilliant, fiercely loyal wife and 2 beautiful children because he wanted a perfect heir. Now, he was a divorced man whose pregnant mistress had been sleeping with his brother-in-law to steal $5 million of his family's money. Malcolm Aldridge, entirely focused on damage control, pulled out his phone. He needed to secure the trust fund money immediately. He needed to make sure Brielle didn't have any legal access to the corporate accounts, and he needed to completely erase Darius from their lives. He dialed Nathan Price, his incredibly expensive, highly discreet private banker at Boston Trust and Wealth Management. Nathan. Malcolm barked the moment the call connected, his authoritative CEO voice completely masking his internal panic. I need you to immediately lock down the primary corporate accounts. Cancel the $5 million trust transfer we discussed yesterday. Do it right now. There was a long, incredibly tense, completely uncharacteristic silence on the other end of the line. Malcolm, Nathan said finally. His voice wasn't deferential. It wasn't professional. It sounded tight, exhausted, and incredibly nervous. I can't cancel the transfer, and I can't lock down the accounts. What are you talking about? Malcolm snapped, pacing aggressively on the sidewalk, glaring at the pedestrians who were staring at his ruined family. I am the primary account holder. I am the CEO of Aldridge Crown Properties. Do what I tell you, or I'll fire you today and move my entire portfolio to a different bank. Do you know who I am? You don't have a portfolio anymore, Malcolm, Nathan replied flatly, dropping a financial anvil directly onto Malcolm's head. At 8:00 a.m. this morning, the Criminal Investigations Division of the Internal Revenue Service served this bank with a massive, highly classified federal warrant. They have officially, permanently frozen every single account associated with your name, Cordelia's name, Sebastian's name, and every single shell company connected to Aldridge Crown Properties. Malcolm stopped pacing. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. Frozen, Malcolm whispered, the authoritative CEO facade instantly cracking. On what grounds? We pay our taxes. This is a massive mistake. Call their legal department. It's not a mistake, Malcolm, Nathan stated, his voice completely devoid of sympathy. The federal agents who served the warrant brought a 400-page whistleblower dossier. I saw the summary sheet. It meticulously details a decade of massive tax fraud, phantom contractors, illegal offshore evasion, and systemic corporate embezzlement. The forensic accounting in that dossier is absolute perfection. The paper trail is flawless. They know everything, Malcolm. They are literally pulling the hard drives out of your corporate headquarters as we speak. They have seized your servers. A dossier? Malcolm gasped, feeling the world violently spin around him. Who? Who gave them a dossier? I don't know. Nathan lied smoothly, clearly wanting to aggressively distance himself from the toxic, radioactive fallout of the Aldridge Empire. But that isn't your biggest problem. What could possibly be worse than a federal IRS raid? Malcolm screamed into the phone, completely losing his mind. The commercial debt, Nathan explained, delivering the final, fatal blow to the Aldridge dynasty. The compliance departments at 3 major commercial lenders contacted me this morning. They received sworn, legally binding affidavits, accompanied by expert forensic handwriting analysis from a former FBI examiner, proving that the guarantor signatures on your $15 million of commercial debt were forged. Malcolm leaned against the brick wall of the clinic, his legs literally trembling. He had forged Elara's initials. He had used her pristine credit score to secure the incredibly low interest rates, keeping his toxic real estate empire afloat. He had assumed she was too stupid, too intimidated, and too distracted by the divorce to ever notice. The guarantor has formally and legally severed her liability. Nathan continued relentlessly. Because the loans were secured under fraudulent pretenses, the banks have immediately triggered the default clauses. They are calling in the $15 million today. Because your liquid assets are frozen by the IRS, you cannot pay the debt. The banks are initiating immediate foreclosure proceedings on every single property in the Aldridge portfolio to recover their massive losses. No, Malcolm whispered, absolute terror gripping his heart. No, Nathan, please. You have to help me. I can leverage the Beacon Hill estate, the equity in Sebastian's house. Sebastian's house? Nathan interrupted, a sharp note of incredulity in his voice. Malcolm, did you not read the divorce settlement Sebastian signed yesterday? What about it? Malcolm asked desperately. He kept the house. We paid the down payment. It's ours. You paid the down payment, Nathan corrected coldly. But the massive primary mortgage was heavily subsidized and backed by Elara Keane's verifiable corporate income. The moment the divorce was finalized, and her income was legally detached from the mortgage profile, the bank's automated risk algorithms flagged the massive debt-to-income disparity. Because Sebastian's income is tied to your now frozen, federally investigated shell companies, his verifiable income is exactly zero. Nathan paused, letting the reality sink in. The bank initiated immediate foreclosure on the Beacon Hill estate 3 hours ago, Malcolm. Federal agents are currently at the property, placing a tax lien on the massive wrought iron gates. Sebastian doesn't have a house. He doesn't have an asset. He is homeless. Malcolm dropped his phone. It hit the concrete sidewalk with a sharp crack, the screen shattering into a massive spiderweb of glass. Cordelia, noticing her husband's absolute, paralyzing terror, stepped away from the light post. "Malcolm," Cordelia asked, her voice shaking violently. "Malcolm, what's wrong? What did Nathan say about the trust fund?" Malcolm didn't answer her. He couldn't speak. He just stared at the shattered phone on the ground, realizing that his entire life, his legacy, his massive wealth, and his freedom had just been completely, utterly annihilated. A sleek, black valet car pulled up to the curb. The clinic valet stepped out, holding the keys to the Aldridge's incredibly expensive Mercedes SUV. "That will be $45 for the VIP parking, Mr. Aldridge," the valet said politely, holding out a portable credit card terminal. Malcolm, operating entirely on pure, stunned autopilot, reached into his wallet and pulled out his heavy metal American Express Centurion card. He handed it to the valet. The valet inserted the heavy card into the machine. "BZZZT. "I'm sorry, sir," the valet said, frowning. "The card has been declined." "Try another one," Malcolm whispered, his voice completely hollow. He handed the valet a high-tier platinum Visa card. "BZZZT declined." Cordelia, watching the absolute humiliation unfold, angrily pulled her own black titanium card from her designer handbag and shoved it aggressively at the valet. "Run this one," Cordelia snapped, desperate to maintain some shred of her aristocratic dignity in front of the clinic staff. "The machine is clearly broken, and I will be speaking to your manager about this delay." The valet ran Cordelia's card. "BZZZT, I'm sorry, ma'am," the valet said, his polite tone entirely vanishing, replaced by deep suspicion. "All 3 cards are returning a fraud lock, accounts frozen error code. Do you have cash?" Cordelia stared at the valet, her perfectly made-up face contorting in absolute shock. She didn't carry cash. She was an Aldridge. She paid for everything with titanium cards. She hadn't looked at a price tag in 30 years. I don't understand," Cordelia stammered, looking at Malcolm. "Malcolm, why are our cards declined?" "Because we're broke, Cordelia." Malcolm finally spoke, his voice completely dead, staring blankly at the traffic. "The IRS froze the accounts. The banks called the loans. We have absolutely nothing. We can't even pay for parking." Sebastian, who had been standing silently near the curb, slowly turned around. "What do you mean we're broke?" Sebastian asked, the reality of the terrifying situation entirely failing to penetrate his profound arrogance. "Dad, stop joking. I need to go home. I need to figure out what to do about Brielle and Darius. I need to go back to the Beacon Hill house and lock the doors." "There is no house, Sebastian," Malcolm said, looking at his son with an expression of absolute crushing defeat. "Elara took her name off the mortgage. The bank foreclosed on it this morning. You have nowhere to go." Sebastian froze. The words hung in the cold Boston air like an absolute death sentence. He had forced his brilliant, loyal wife to sign a humiliating divorce settlement, aggressively kicking her and his son out of their home to make way for a pregnant mistress. He thought he was brilliant. He thought he had secured the perfect legacy. Instead, his mistress had been sleeping with his brother-in-law. His perfect heir was a massive biological fraud. His father was facing federal prison for tax evasion, and he was currently standing on the sidewalk, entirely broke, unable to even pay a $45 parking fee. They had laughed when Elara left. Now they were standing in the ashes of their own absolute destruction. Thousands of miles away, in the historic, incredibly beautiful city of Edinburgh, Scotland. It was mid-afternoon. I had just spent 3 hours walking with Iris and Theo through the incredible, sprawling grounds of Edinburgh Castle. We had watched the 1 o'clock gunfire. explored the ancient stone dungeons, and looked out over the entire city. Theo had run up the steep hills without stopping once, his lungs perfectly clear in the sharp, unpolluted Scottish air. After the castle, we walked down to a small, charming outdoor cafe near the Royal Mile. Iris was happily eating a massive chocolate pastry, telling me all about the history she had just learned. Theo was sitting next to her, drawing a picture of the castle with bright crayons. He wasn't defective. He was thriving. He was perfect. I smiled, taking a slow sip of my warm, perfectly brewed tea. I opened my laptop, connected to the secure VPN I had set up weeks ago, and logged into a highly encrypted, anonymous voicemail portal. Before I threw my American SIM card into the trash at Logan Airport, I had aggressively forwarded my primary phone number to this portal. I wanted to know when the bombs detonated. I wanted to hear the explosion. There were 14 new voicemails. All of them were from the Aldridge family. I put in my noise-canceling earbuds, selected the first voicemail from Sebastian, and pressed play. Elara, Sebastian's voice blasted through the headphones, sounding completely, terrifyingly hysterical. Elara, pick up the phone. Please, you have to pick up the phone. Everything is gone. Brielle? The baby isn't mine, Elara. The baby belongs to Darius. She was using me to steal the trust fund money. He sobbed loudly into the phone, the pathetic, weak sound of a broken narcissist who had just realized he was the absolute punchline of a massive joke. And the bank, Elara. The bank foreclosed on the house, Sebastian wept. Dad says the IRS froze all the accounts. They're saying, you sent a dossier. Elara, please, this has to be a massive mistake. Please call the bank. Tell them it's a clerical error. Tell them you'll back the mortgage again. I don't have anywhere to live. Please, Elara, I'm sorry. I'll do anything. I didn't smile. I didn't feel a surge of vindictive joy. I just felt a profound, absolute sense of closure. I deleted the voicemail. I clicked on the next message. It was from Cordelia. Elara, darling. Cordelia's voice purred through the headphones. She was trying desperately to sound calm, aristocratic, and maternal, but I could hear the absolute, paralyzing terror shaking violently in her vocal cords. Elara, it seems there has been a terrible misunderstanding with Malcolm's corporate accounts. Cordelia continued smoothly, lying through her teeth. And this awful business with Brielle. Well, we always knew she wasn't right for Sebastian. We always knew you were the strongest branch of the family tree, Elara. You are Iris and Theo's mother. We are family. We need you to come back to Boston and help us sort out this little financial mess. Malcolm says you have assets in Scotland. We can use those to... I stopped the playback. For 8 years, she had called me a dead end. She had called my son defective. She had treated me like a disposable middle-class tool. And the absolute second her toxic empire collapsed, she desperately tried to manipulate me into paying for her survival. She wanted to use the money I had safely secured in the Caledonia Shield Trust to pay off Malcolm's criminal debts. It was the most pathetic, genuinely hilarious thing I had ever heard. I didn't delete Cordelia's voicemail. I saved it. It was the absolute, undeniable proof that I had won. I closed my laptop, took out my earbuds, and looked at my 2 beautiful children. Are you guys ready to go see the museum? I asked, smiling warmly at them. Yes, Theo cheered, jumping up from his chair. I paid the cafe bill with a premium, high-tier corporate card issued by McLaren Forensic Partners, the massive international accounting firm in Edinburgh that had just hired me as a senior partner. I left a generous tip, grabbed my children's hands, and walked down the beautiful, historic streets of my new home. The Aldridge family thought they were royalty. They thought they could use me, abuse me, and discard me without consequence. They didn't understand that when you build your entire empire on fraud, lies, and the exploitation of the person who actually knows how to read the balance sheets, you are entirely at their mercy. I had signed the divorce papers in silence. I had let them keep the house. I had let them keep the pregnant mistress. Because I knew that the moment I walked away, the entire $15 million illusion was going to violently, catastrophically burn to the ground. I opened my heavily encrypted phone one last time. I didn't reply to Cordelia's pathetic, incredibly manipulative voicemail. I didn't reply to Sebastian's desperate, hysterical sobbing. They weren't worth the digital data required to send a text message. Instead, I opened the encrypted messaging app and navigated to the massive, highly exclusive group chat labeled Aldridge Dynasty. It was the group chat Cordelia had used for 8 years to coordinate highly curated country club dinners, brag about Sebastian's fake corporate achievements, and subtly, relentlessly mock my middle-class background. It was the digital throne room of their fake empire, and I was about to burn it down. I looked at the member list: Malcolm, Cordelia, Sebastian, Avery, Darius, and, added just 2 days ago as the shiny new replacement, Brielle. I started typing. To the Aldridge family. I wrote, my thumbs moving swiftly across the screen. I received your voicemails. I understand that the Aurora 5 clinic appointment was incredibly revealing, and I hope the expanded genetic panel was worth the VIP surcharge. I also understand that the IRS and the commercial lending banks have initiated their respective, entirely inevitable asset seizure. I paused, taking a slow sip of my Scottish tea, feeling absolutely, profoundly serene. I am not returning to Boston. I will not call the banks to fix the clerical error, because there is no error. Malcolm, you explicitly, illegally forged my initials on $15 million of toxic commercial debt. You tried to use me as a human shield for your failing shell game. I have legally detached my liability and provided sworn affidavits to the compliance boards. The foreclosure on the Beacon Hill estate is permanent, and the asset liquidation has already begun. You will not get a single cent from that house. Cordelia, you spent 8 years calling my son defective. You spent 8 years obsessing over a pure bloodline and treating me like a disposable incubator. I sincerely hope you enjoy explaining to your country club friends that your perfect, immaculate heir actually belongs to Darius, and that your husband is currently facing federal indictment for massive, systemic tax fraud based on a 400-page dossier I personally compiled. Avery, your brand is built on an illusion. The illusion is over. I suggest you start looking for a real job. Sebastian, you traded a fiercely loyal family for a 24-year-old grifter who orchestrated a $5 million trust fund scam right under your nose. You thought you were upgrading. You were actually just an incredibly easy mark. You deserve absolutely everything that is happening to you right now. Do not attempt to contact me again. I have transferred all of my assets to an overseas trust that your creditors cannot touch. My physical location is entirely secure. If any member of the Aldridge family attempts to circumvent this boundary, my international legal team will immediately file aggressive harassment charges and provide further, highly damaging financial documentation to the federal authorities. Enjoy the ashes of your empire. Sincerely, Elara Keane. I hit send. I watched the tiny delivered icons pop up next to every single name in the group chat. I didn't wait to see if anyone started typing a frantic, pleading reply. I tapped the options menu, selected Leave Group, and permanently deleted the chat history from my device. I completely deactivated my old email addresses, shut down the anonymous voicemail portal, and severed the final digital thread tying me to my toxic past. I closed my laptop and slid it into my designer tote bag. I looked at Iris and Theo. They had finished their chocolate pastries and were eagerly looking at a massive tourist map of the city. Okay, guys, I announced, standing up and grabbing their hands. Let's go explore the castle. We spent the entire afternoon walking the ancient cobblestone streets of Edinburgh. We explored the massive stone fortress of Edinburgh Castle. We walked up the Royal Mile, listening to bagpipers and eating hot fish and chips from a local vendor. The air was incredibly crisp and clean. Theo, who used to struggle to climb a single flight of stairs in Boston without using his emergency inhaler, ran ahead of us, laughing brightly, his lungs perfectly clear in the fresh, unpolluted Scottish air. The toxic, suffocating stress of the Aldridge household had vanished, and my children were thriving. 6 months later, the absolute, unmitigated destruction of the Aldridge family was complete. It was a cold, rainy November afternoon in Edinburgh. I was sitting in my massive, highly modernized corner office at McLaren Forensic Partners. one of the most prestigious elite international accounting firms in Europe. As a newly appointed senior partner, I was currently overseeing a massive corporate audit for a major European tech conglomerate. My assistant buzzed my intercom. "Ms. Keane," the assistant said smoothly, "the final dossier on the American litigation has arrived from the legal team in Boston. Should I bring it in?" "Yes, please," I replied, signing a stack of financial approvals. The assistant walked in and placed a thick, heavily redacted legal file on my desk. It was the final update on the Aldridge Crown Properties collapse. I didn't obsess over them anymore, but my legal team provided standard quarterly updates to ensure the offshore trust remained completely insulated from their massive bankruptcy proceedings. I opened the file. The reality of their downfall was even more spectacular and terrifying than I had initially calculated. Malcolm Aldridge had been officially indicted by the Department of Justice on 27 federal counts of wire fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit bank fraud. The 400-page dossier I had provided to the IRS was a completely lethal, airtight prosecution document. Facing decades in federal prison, Malcolm had desperately tried to negotiate a plea deal, offering to name political contacts, but the prosecutors ruthlessly refused. They had him dead to rights on the forged signatures alone. His trial was set for the spring, and legal analysts predicted he would serve no less than 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Aldridge Crown Properties was entirely liquidated. The massive real estate empire, built entirely on my forged credit and toxic shell companies, was sold off in pieces at federal auction to cover the massive IRS tax liens and the $15 million in defaulted commercial debt. The Beacon Hill estate, the luxury mansion Sebastian had fought so aggressively to steal from me in the divorce settlement, had been sold by the bank at a massive loss to a foreign investor who planned to gut the entire property. Cordelia Aldridge, entirely stripped of her massive wealth, her social status, and her precious country club memberships, was forced to move into a tiny, deeply depressing two-bedroom apartment in a highly undesirable suburb. The aristocratic matriarch who had spent her entire life mocking middle-class people was now entirely reliant on a meager, heavily garnished Social Security check. Her entire elite social circle had completely, aggressively abandoned her the moment the scandal broke. Avery and Darius were officially divorced. The highly public, incredibly humiliating revelation at the Aurora 5 clinic had completely destroyed Avery's social media influencer career. Brands dropped her immediately, refusing to be associated with the massive scandal. She was currently working as a low-level sales associate at a suburban mall, desperately trying to pay off the massive legal debts from her divorce. Brielle Carter, the pregnant mistress who had orchestrated the entire $5 million trust fund scam, had completely vanished. The moment the Aldridge accounts were frozen, and she realized there was no money left to steal, she had packed her bags and fled Boston, entirely abandoning Darius and the baby scheme. She was likely hunting for her next target, and Sebastian, the perfect heir to a multi-million-dollar empire, was currently 34 years old, completely broke, entirely unemployed, and living in the tiny spare bedroom of his mother's depressing suburban apartment. He had no house, he had no wife, he had no perfect son. He had traded a brilliant, fiercely loyal forensic accountant and 2 beautiful children for an absolute biological and financial disaster. He was a complete, utter failure, entirely dependent on a mother who blamed him for bringing Brielle into the family. I closed the legal file and slid it into the heavy-duty industrial shredder next to my desk. I didn't need to read anymore. I didn't care about their misery. They were no longer a threat. They were just a cautionary tale about the incredible danger of mocking the person who literally holds the keys to your financial survival. My office phone rang. I picked it up. It was Alistair McLaren, the incredibly sharp, deeply respected managing partner of the firm. "Elara," Alistair said warmly, his thick Scottish accent filling the line. "I just reviewed your preliminary audit on the German tech acquisition. It's absolutely brilliant work. You found over 2 million euros in hidden liabilities that their own internal team completely missed." Thank you, Alistair, I replied, smiling. It's all in the paper trail. People always try to hide the bad debt in the phantom vendor logs. You just have to know where to look. Well, your forensic skills are unmatched. Alistair praised genuinely. The board is incredibly impressed. We're authorizing a significant bonus for you this quarter, Elara. And I wanted to personally invite you and your children to the firm's holiday gala at the estate next month. My wife would love to meet Iris and Theo. We would be honored, Alistair, I said sincerely. Thank you. I hung up the phone. I stood up and walked over to the massive, floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office. I looked out over the beautiful, historic skyline of Edinburgh. The ancient stone buildings, the rolling green hills, the massive castle sitting proudly in the distance under the Scottish sky. I wasn't a dead end. I wasn't a middle-class accountant desperate for the approval of a toxic, fake wealthy family. I was Elara Keane. I was a senior partner at an international financial firm. I had a pristine credit score, a massive, highly secure offshore trust, and a beautiful, healthy family. I had signed the divorce papers in silence. I had let them keep the house. I had let them keep the pregnant mistress, because I knew that the moment I walked away, the entire $15 million illusion was going to violently, catastrophically burn to the ground. And I wanted to be standing on a different continent when the ashes finally settled. So, tell me honestly in the comments below, if your incredibly toxic, fake wealthy husband aggressively forced you to sign a humiliating divorce settlement, kicking you and your asthmatic son out of your home to make way for a pregnant mistress and his perfect new heir, would you stay in Boston, fighting a messy, highly emotional court battle for pennies while his horrific family mocked you? Or would you quietly sign the papers, legally detach your name from their massive, toxic commercial debt, send a 400-page tax fraud dossier to the IRS, and fly to Scotland, leaving them to discover at a VIP ultrasound that the mistress's baby actually belonged to the brother-in-law right as the feds seized their entire empire? Let me know. I read every single one.